This is English Literature Web YouTube channel. I am Professor L.B. Gayakawad. I will request you first to share, like, comment and subscribe my YouTube channel. Today we are discussing on the growth of poetry in the 16th century. In the first part we saw some topic, and today in the second part we will see the some topic, means we will see the topic. The poetry of the 16th century was the anti-clerical satire, and this anti-clerical satire was very much famous in those days. Remember, anti-clerical means there was no clerical matters about the poetry. That was the matter which was anti, means anti-clerical. And this feature of the poetry was famous, very popular, very noteworthy. And the second thing I will explain is that Spenser was the poet. He was the famous poet, or he was the popular poet in those days. This Spenser paints or describes Gloriana as Elizabeth Queen in Fairy Queen, which has been popular in those days. So remember, this is the best example of Gloriana as Elizabeth the Queen, and this was the best example of Spenser. This Spenser was the best poet. But if we see again, then we will understand that the poetry of the 16th century was not so spontaneous, or it was not like the poetry of the 19th century, or I will say it is not the poetry of like the 17th century, means the poetry of the poet William Wordsworth was very nice because it was written as the overflow, spontaneous overflow. But it is not the poetry of the 16th century, and that's why the 16th century is called as drab and golden by the critic C.S. Lewis. So here we will see now again the next feature of this poetry. The poets were protecting the nationalism. Remember, all these poets were protecting the nationalism. It means that they were writing their poems on the nationalism. Means that nationalism was the main feature or main quality of their poetry, and that's why they were writing on the nationalism. And all these poems were vindicating the theme of the nationalism. The poets were cultivating again the native languages. Remember, it is very much anti-thing, or this was very much opposite of each other. Means the poets were writing their poems on the national matters, or the nationalism was the main theme of these poets. But the poets were also giving importance to the local languages also, the native languages also. Means that they were using the vernacular language in their poetry. So this is the main thing by which the poetry of the 16th century did not reach to the height. Italy and France were revolting against the Latin language. This was also the lacuna of this 16th century poetry, that there were the two countries, Italy and France, they were revolting against the Latin language. Means they were not liking the Latin language, or they rejected the Latin language. It means they were opposite of the Latin language. And when we see the literature, or when we see the poetry or any kind of we see the literature, then language is important. Means there should not be any kind of boycott to any language, and the poets or the writers should be free to write as per their opinions or as per the situation available. But in this era, in this 16th century, there were many problems, and this problem was the severe problem. Italy and France were revolting against the Latin language. Means they did not like the Latin language. It is seen, observed through their revolt. And this was the particular thing which was responsible factor for not progressing the poetry of the 16th century. The translation in new vernacular was done by the poets. Remember, the poets were translating the literary pieces into the vernacular language, means I will say into the native languages, means the native dialect. It means the native, I will say, registers were used by the poets. And there was the theme of the nationalism also. So at the level of the nationalism, this translation made in the vernacular language is not rich, or it is not powerful, or it will not be accepted by the nationalism of the people. And this was the main barrier, or this was the main problem in the 16th century, that the poetry was not in the progress or in the situation of the progress. And those poets were translating Virgil into hexameter. Now see, what is hexameter? Hexameter means the poems which is written in the 6 feet, means the line is written in the 6 feet. That is the way, that is the I will say, that is the method of writing the poem or the poetry. So see, the poets were translating Virgil into the English hexameter. This was also very difficult thing for the readers, because hexameter, this was also very difficult, or today it is very difficult for the readers. In those days also it was very difficult to absorb, to grasp, or to collect into mind. And that's why these poets were attempting, but they were not getting the progress, or they were not developing themselves in the progress of the poetry, because of these difficult things, because their poetry was generalized poetry, means it was not the specific poetry. Means as the poetry of the 19th century, when we see of William Wordsworth, then we see that the poetry of this poet, of the William Wordsworth, is based on nature, is based on spontaneous overflow. And that's why this poetry has been very much easy for understanding the readers. And that's why this poetry, or the poetry of William Wordsworth and his companions, has become very much famous or popular in the English literature. But this was not the situation of the poetry in the 16th century, and that's why this poetry did not come to the height of progress. Defense of poesy was studied critically. Now see, Defense of Poesy is the literary piece by Sir Philip Sidney, and this literary piece was studied by the poets critically. Means the poets were studying it again and again, and all the poets were following the guidelines of this Defense of Poesy only, because it was only one piece to be followed in those days, and that's why we do not find the particular way of writing the poetry, and that's why this century is not going, or was not going, or I will say did not reach to the height of the progress like other centuries in the sense of the poetry. The Renaissance critical theory was in focus. Now see, again there was the Renaissance critical theory in force. In force means there was the force on this Renaissance critical theory. Means exactly the poets were not staying on the particular theme. There was not the particular guide to the poets, and they were not taking the particular theme to be discussed in the poem, and that's why we see here that the poetry of the 16th century is not found in the sense of progression. Then conservativeness was the base of the century. Remember, this century was going through the conservativeness, means the traditionalism was there, or the society was going through the conservative opinions, means there was not the particular development of the society, the minds of people were not developed, and that was also the problem to the poets of this century, and that's why they were not able to adopt the particular theme to write their poems or their poetry. So this poetry is a general poetry, means there are a lot of subjects, means, or there are a lot of themes according to the critics, or according to me also, because they have not taken the particular theme at them, or as a guide for them, only because of all these things or all these matters which have come in front of them. Allegories and dreams. Visions were written in 7 line stanzas in the opening years. Remember, this is also the particular thing, and because of this thing also, the poets were not going into the particular theme of the progression, and that was the real problem of the poetry, and that poetry was not reaching to the development. There was the period of Henry VII. The best poets in this period were Scottish William Dunbar, Gavin Douglas, and Sir David Lindsay as the followers of Geoffrey Chaucer. Stefan House was the first English poet who published The Pastime of Pleasure in 1509. Means, remember, there was only one poet, and that poet was Stefan House. This Stefan House was only one poet, English poet, who published only The Pastime of Pleasure. When we see the title here, The Pastime of Pleasure, then we know that this is the only poet who has taken the title as The Pastime of Pleasure. Means he has thought of the entertainment or he has thought of the spontaneous overflow, because there are the words past time, means he has thought of the past time, he has remembered his past here, and he has thought about the pleasure, about the happiness to man, and this thing has been a good thing only there. But Stephen House was only the poet, means he was only one poet, and means there were not many poets like this, and that's why the poetry of the 16th century did not go to the height of the progression. Berkeley borrowed from the continent. Remember, there were many, I will say, there are the continents, there were many continents, means the purpose of telling is that there were the continents, means there were the sectors of countries, and this Berkeley was borrowing his themes, his literature, his ideas from the continents. And that's why also it was not the proper way to the poets to write their poetry in the particular theme. And that's why uh, Berkeley borrowed from the continent. That was also the proof that there was not the specific theme, and that's why the poetry was not going to the development. We receive the poetry of Watt, Petrarch, and Sidney in the Elizabethan era. Remember, in the Elizabethan era, there are the poets. Some poets are there only, and they are the poets Watt, Petrarch, and Sidney. These are the poets, and this Berkeley was borrowing from the continent. And these poets, Watt, Petrarch, and Sidney, were writing their poems. And they were also writing their poems based on their experiences. And that's why here again and again we will say that the poetry of the 16th century was not going up to the height of the progression. And that's why C.S. Lewis, the popular critic, says that the poetry of the 16th century was a drab and golden era. The best poem was written by Sir John Davies, Orchestra, Dr. A poem of dancing in 1596. This was the best poem. Today also, when we read this poem, we will see that this poem is the best poem. But the best poems are limited, or were limited in those days. And that's why, again, the same thing is there, that the poetry of the 16th century have not taken the progress there. Petrarch invented his own rhyme. Remember, Petrarch was the best poet, or today is also, he is the well-known poet. And when we see Petrarch, then he has given us the Petrarchan sonnet. And that's why now this is the point of Petrarch. This Petrarch invented his own rhyme called the Petrarchan rhyme, which was followed by the poets. Remember, this is the important thing, or I will say this is the best thing on the part of the 16th century, that the poets were there and they had got the guide, and that guide was this Petrarch, and this Petrarch had found his own method or rhyme, and that was the Petrarchan rhyme. And that's why all the poets followed this, and they wrote their poems following the Petrarchan rhyme, and that was the best thing in this century. Readers declined the epigram. Remember, again, this thing was very much revolting thing that the readers did not like, means they declined, they rejected the epigram. So what is epigram? Epigram is the short type of poetry. This is the short type of poetry, and this short type of poetry, that is the epigram, was also declined or rejected or ignored by the readers, because it was also not powerful, and that's why the readers did not like this epigram also. The antithesis was one of the genres. Now see, we have seen that there were many genres, because we have seen in the first part that the poetry of the 16th century was a generalized poetry, means there were general themes. There was not a specific or particular theme. And here also, the point has come that the antithesis was one of the genres, means there was the style. Genre means style. There was the style of the antithesis, means the poets had taken the style of the antithesis and they were writing their poems using the antithesis, and that was also the generalized theme. Love sonnets were written on the success and failures of the lovers, as the mistress was unkind or the mistresses were unkind. So now see, this is the, I will say, interesting thing, because love sonnets, because just we saw that Petrarch was there. He found out his uh, own Petrarchan rhyme type, and other poets followed him, and that's why the poets started their poems, that is called love sonnets, uh, to write the uh, sexual matters, or suppose the loving matters or romantic matters, and that's why love sonnets were written on the success and failures of the lovers. Means love is the important part in the life of the man. In those days also, the women were falling in love with men and men were falling in love with women. But actually, the women were not giving responses to the men. And that's why the matter was very serious, or it was the bad thing on the part of the writers, that is the poets, and so they were influenced by these love matters, and so the poets wrote their poems called the love sonnets on the failures or success of the lovers. Means some lovers were being successful and some lovers were not being successful because of the beloveds or because of the mistresses. For example, here is given that Sydney's Astrophel and Stella was the best guide to the poets. Means, see, Sidney, Philip Sidney wrote the poem Astrophel and Stella. This is the poem which is based on the love factor. And this poem had become very much famous in those days. And this poem was the best guide to other poets. And other poets were influenced by this Astrophel and Stella, and they wrote their poems based on love by following this Astrophel and Stella. So here today we have seen the part second of the 16th century poetry development. Then in the next, means in the third part also, we will see the topic, the same topic we will see, means in the third lecture also, or in the third part also, we will see the same poetry of the 16th century. But before stopping my lecture, I will request you all to like, share, comment, and subscribe my channel. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much.